educational tutorial types of webinars for our members. So if there's a topic that you would like for us to consider, please feel free to contact me or let me know, and we'll be glad to see what we can do for you. I want to introduce Sabrina Kay, who is with Capable Financial Solutions. She will be our presenter for this morning. Many of you may remember Sabrina. She taught financial management classes for GMA and for the Carl Vinson Institute of Government. She was a great help and asset to me in my days of the city government. So we are delighted to have Sabrina working with us as we offer some QuickBooks training. And actually this is our second webinar in a series that we are planning. So with that, just thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina so we can get started with the QuickBooks training.
Thank you, Pam. As Pam mentioned, this is our second of several series on QuickBooks Pro 2013 that we're adapting for Georgia cities. I am Sabrina Kay with Capable Financials. I'm going to lead our session today. We do welcome your questions, so please just type those in using the GoToWebinar instructions you've been providing, directing your questions to me. We are going to work to get those answered throughout the session, but if we find that your question is unique to your government, we may not cover it during the session, but I'll follow up with you directly after the session. As we get started, the history on this is Pam Helton and other members of GMA, they visit with cities throughout the year. They're in constant contact with their membership trying to determine their needs. Based upon what was heard, visits with small cities around the state of Georgia, we've developed a tool today, and this is the second in our series to help those cities currently using QuickBooks to optimize its use and functionality to the best of their ability. QuickBooks 2013 Pro is not technically designed for fund accounting, which is required in local governments, but QuickBooks is a less expensive alternative that many cities use in conjunction with other software applications like utility billing software, occupational tax, property tax, for example, to report on the city's financials. We've attempted to combine the specifics within QuickBooks Pro with material that is specific to Georgia cities, such as the Uniform Chart of Accounts and other financial-related laws, to help our cities better understand how to use the QuickBooks products to more efficiently run the operations of City Hall. Keep in mind, QuickBooks has not been designed to perform fund accounting as it truly exists that is unique to government. We've created some workarounds to help us make QuickBooks 2013 adapt to our needs. We are not representing QuickBooks in these tutorial sessions. All rights related to QuickBooks remain with Intuit, and you'll see a notation at the bottom of each screen to that effect. Our objectives for today include the accounts payable cycle, which is entering invoices and paying vendors. And we're going to do that while using best practices and standardization in order to achieve the optimum results in accounts payable. So let's get started. You'll see our objectives listed here. We are going to set up vendors. We're going to enter invoices. We're going to code invoices. We're going to process payments, and we're going to review report. But probably the first place to get started is what is accounts payable, or what is AP. When you use the word AP or accounts payable, it means different things to different people. The definition to me means that a city is paying their vendors timely and correctly. Other than personnel cost, accounts payable is what determines your expenditures for your budgeting purposes. Therefore, if you understate your accounts payable, how much you owe your vendors, then you can be understating your fund balance and where you are financially. Therefore, AP becomes very important to understanding your finances. No one notices, really, quite honestly, when AP is running smoothly. It is pretty much taken for granted, but lots of people will notice when AP is dysfunctional and vendors are calling demanding payment or not wanting to do business with the city because they are not being paid accurately and timely. Your departments and services will suffer when AP is not running smoothly because your departments won't be able to get what they need in order to provide the services they constantly provide. So it is extremely important that we make sure AP is running smoothly. In our first session, which was titled Navigation and Setup, we learned how to set up a company or fund and the chart of accounts for a sample general fund. We will be going to that company we previously created in our last session to begin our work on accounts payable. To access the company or general fund, we will go to File, Open Company, and then we will select the company or fund that we are going to work with. Remember, we called ours the City of Exampleville. Remember, what we typically call a fund, QuickBooks calls a new company. As we discussed in our previous session, we may have a separate company for the general fund, one for water, one for SPLOST, for example. But we'll get started in our general fund in City of Exampleville. Let's review a little bit about navigation, because remember, in QuickBooks you can get to the same area in a couple of different ways. Remember, Home always takes you back to the main page. Let's look at the first area, which is the area in yellow. This area here is basically what we call the icon bars, are the functional areas. We're going to be focusing on the vendor accounts payable area. You can get to that way. Also remember the area here that is circled in orange, this is considered the process flow area. So in accounts payable, we would typically enter bills. Then after we finishing enter bills, we would pay bills. That is a process flow, meaning you do this step, enter bills, before you do the pay bills. The red arrow also indicates a way to get to the vendor site. And the red arrow, if you click on it, this will get you to the full section. And so you can get to vendors 3 different ways: icon bars, process flow, or the functional area. Either way, it will take you to the same place. When we get inside the vendor area here, you'll start to see it looks a little bit differently. You'll notice right now that our vendor area is blank in this white area because we have not entered any vendors as of this point. QuickBooks does allow an import process for a more experienced user, but we're going to go through the process of actually entering those vendors manually. Vendor setup is an extremely important area because your vendor files are where you can actually catch and reduce fraud by knowing your vendors, knowing their pricing structure to the city. Your vendor files also help you comply with laws and regulations such as E-Verify and 1099s. Vendor master files help you know where you spend your money because you can run reports by vendor, by commodity, by dollar amount, and by transaction volume. But you can only get these reports if you utilize vendor setup to its fullest. We get a little bit slack in this area of using vendor setup to its fullest, and then when we can't get the reports we want, we wonder why we can't get them. It's because we haven't invested the time in the vendor setup. If everything is handled correctly inside the vendor setup and inside the AP processing, you are likely to reduce the likelihood of duplicate payments. All these operational efficiencies can help your city save money, and probably by now you are already able to tell that I think vendor setup is an extremely important task. So we click New Vendor. Inside the vendor setup, there are tabs. The tabs are denoted right here, and you take it tab by tab. The address info, you have to first establish some data entry standardization conventions, such as you must decide how you are going to give your vendors a code. The vendor that we're setting up here is ABC Company, and we've chosen that our vendor ID is going to be 8 letters. Here we've chosen to do all capital letters because that's another thing that needs to be decided. Will you be doing all capitals or capitals and lowercase? And in these naming conventions, some folks, where we've selected to do 8 here, some will just key the name of the vendor until it runs out of space. But it's important that whatever naming convention you decide on, that everybody is aware of that naming convention. In the address tab of the vendor, you'll notice there's 5 different tabs on the vendor page setup, and we're going to walk through each one of them. The address, of course, information you know how to enter, telephone numbers, and the main number and a work number, as well as fax and cell phone numbers. And in addition, email addresses and websites are also helpful in the setup. If the vendor is getting their invoices from you at the same location they're shipping the goods from you, if you will click the copy in the middle, it will just bring what you key from the bill to address over to the ship to address. The bill from address is actually where the payment will be remitted, and the shipping will sometimes help you in your purchasing aspects. Now we're into the payment setting tab. The payment setting tab is where you'll enter the account number that the city uses with the vendor, and the payment terms is extremely important because this determines how often you pay the vendors. Most vendors have a payment terms of net 30. Now, this isn't necessarily what the vendor puts on his or her invoice. This is oftentimes what you as a city have decided that the payment terms will be with this particular vendor. If your vendor utilizes and allows you to take discounts, if you'll use the drop-down menu in the payment terms, then it will actually give you the option to set up a discount. And I just want to remind everybody about discounts. If early payments, if your vendor happens to offer you a 1% discount, just remember that equates to an 18% rate of return, which is much better than what you're getting on your bank accounts and investments at the current time. Utilizations of discounts is an excellent way to save your city money if you've got the cash flow to do so and you have the ability to quickly generate your payments to your vendors. The credit limit over on the right-hand side is what you've established with this vendor, meaning when are they going to cut you off from any supplies. The reason this becomes important is it helps you know when you've reached your credit limit so that you can actually pay this vendor, because what you would hate to happen is your departments not be able to get the goods and services they need to run their departments because of non-payment to a vendor. So that's what would be happening at the Payment Settings tab: account number, payment terms, and then the credit limit. The tax setting tab of the vendor setup is where you capture information related to 1099s. If the vendor is to receive a 1099, then you will check the box vendor eligible for 1099, and you will key either the federal ID number or the Social Security number that the vendor has provided to you on the W-9. The IRS.gov, you can get more information about 1099s and the Form 1096 that you have to transmit for the 1099s. Cities should make sure that they thoroughly understand the rules related to 1099s so you can adequately determine if this box needs to be checked or if this box needs to remain unchecked. Also remember that the IRS has a federal ID or TIN matching program on their website so that you can compare what the vendors give to you on their W-9 with the IRS database to make sure that you have gotten all the information that you need. 1099s are typically issued to service providers, which are oftentimes accountants, attorneys, consultants, and others that supply a service, not a product, to the city. And again, currently you can find those instructions on IRS.gov. 1099s are currently given to the recipient by January 31st, and they are mailed to the IRS by February 28th. And more information can be found on their website. Under the Account Setting tab, this is what gets the general ledger information. This is what I call an Investment Data Entry tab, meaning you take time on the front end to enter the information, which saves you time during process and on the back end. For example, If ABC Company, typically this vendor is used by a certain department for a certain product, you would go ahead and put the general ledger account number used. So if this vendor was used by the street department and it was used for supplies, you would actually put the general ledger account number for streets in here. You can use multiple account numbers, so if you have a vendor that is used by 5 different departments that need to be coded to 5 different GL accounts, you can actually put those in at this time. The additional info tab is a good way to standardize some reporting that you may wish to receive. And oftentimes this field is used for commodities, so that when you want to see how many vendors do we use for a certain product, you can run a report. If these types of fields they are user defined, and if they're not set up, then you're not able to utilize that report without going through trouble. Like, for example, you might want to put tires, and you might want to put all the vendors that you have with tires if you use multiple vendors for tires. Or if you use multiple vendors for fuel, you might want to put the vendor type as fuel. That way, when you're ready to run reports, you can run reports that say, give me all of the vendors that we buy fuel from. And if you're doing any kind of competitive purchasing or competitive pricing citywide, this is also a good field for you to use to capture that information. So after we've entered all 5 tabs, address, payment, tax settings, account settings, and additional info, we click OK. But one of the things we need to talk about is standardization inside your vendor setup. Standardization is really important, especially if you have transition or if you have new folks that are actually coming into the accounts payable process, so that you are able to fully utilize all the benefits. Here are just a few that are suggested when you are actually naming the vendor, because sorts will be affected by this, searches will be affected by this, so it's always important to establish how you're going to enter names. Several cities will say we're not going to use any punctuation at all, which means no periods, no commas, no hyphens, anything like that, because they're all used differently. Are you going to do 1 space after an initial, or are you going to do 2 spaces after an initial? No apostrophes. And really, in government, one of the biggest things is consistent use of abbreviations. For example, how are you going to list state agencies? Department of Revenue, are you going to spell out Department of Revenue? Or are you going to do DOR? Are you going to do D space, O space, R space? So it's a really good idea to have a lot of consistency in this area, and your types actually will help you there to be able to do that as you are typing out the names to have this listing and this standardization. Why do we put in LLC, INC, or CORP as part of the name? This helps in 1099 processes, because currently the IRS has ruled that corporations do not receive 1099s. But be careful on your LLCs. You'll want to check those closely, because LLCs can be corporations, and they can also be other forms of entity structure. So just these are a couple of things to, as you develop what your standard is, so that you have consistency inside your database.
Sabrina?
Yes.
We have received a question.
Yes, absolutely.
The question is there a way to enter the company's E-Verify number to help with our reporting at year-end for contract vendors?
That is a great question. And actually, one of the fields that are used, I'm going to back up just a second so that you can see. The vendor type is also another one that you could use there, as opposed to just using it for commodities. You could type in E-Verify, and you could use, you could define the custom fields here. I would not suggest using like some of the other fields that might be for another purpose, because you may decide that you want to use it later and it doesn't pull up as many on reports. So typically inside the vendors, this additional info where you define these fields right here is a great place to put that E-Verify number. And if you don't know much about E-Verify, there's lots of tools and resources on GMA's website regarding the E-Verify process and the reporting that is required by December 31st each year. So that's a great question. Moving on, now that we have actually keyed the vendor in, now we're going to look at how do we actually enter the invoices. So in this particular case, we're going to select the vendor that we set up, which was ABC Company, and we didn't really fill anything out for the general ledger. So what happened was when this vendor pops up and we see this vendor over here on the right-hand side, we haven't entered any transactions for them. So if we're going to enter an invoice for the vendor, we click on New Transactions, and it will actually bring up that particular vendor. Now the very first thing I want to show here is where the yellow arrow is, because our string of account numbers is pretty long. So in order to make that wider, if you will just actually click on top of that fine line and drag, you will alter the column width so that you can see your account number better. You'll notice that the vendor information, what populates, and what populates is we set this vendor up with a 30-day payment, so the due date populates from those net terms. If we had set up something differently, it would have populated that. If we had a discount rate, it would have appeared here. So we're ready to key the invoice for this particular vendor. The reference number is the invoice number. And in just a second, we're going to talk about standardization here as well. Because you had standardization in the vendor name setup, we also need to have some standardization in how this number is keyed. Because the account number wasn't entered on the invoice, we've selected the account number down here, and we've selected repairs and maintenance inside the street department, and the street department is part of Public Works. And we've keyed the amount. Typically, if you have multiple departments that are using, you'll key the whole amount here, and then you'll key each various department. And in this case, we only had one department that was actually using it, so we keyed it in both places there. The invoice date comes from the invoice, and the reference number comes from, of course, the invoice number. Now you can see the reason why I suggested that you might want to move your column over because of the width of the account number, because that's an important thing for you to be able to see. Here are some examples of invoice numbers. A couple of general rules when you put an invoice number in the reference field is that we don't use punctuation, no commas, no periods, no backslashes, no hyphens. We also do not use any leading zeros. So over here on the left-hand side is the right way to key it, and over here on the right side is the incorrect. You'll see here we don't want that backslash. Here we don't want these preceding zeros because it messes up your sorts. Here we don't want any spaces because that will impact your sort, or any hyphens. So the best way to key those invoices are without those zeros, without those hyphens, without those periods, so that your searches, when you're looking for a duplicate invoice number, you're able to find that and make sure that it doesn't happen. I'm a strong advocate of when I push a button, I want to know what it is actually doing to my general ledger. So this is what is happening behind the scenes when you actually create an invoice. When we create an invoice, we are actually increasing the expenditure that occurs, and we are increasing accounts payable. So when we enter that invoice, what is happening is it is actually debiting office supplies in an example here, And office supplies basically is an expense, and we are, to increase an expense, we go the exact same way of its normal balance, so that is why we debit. Accounts payable is a liability. What do we owe the vendor? And we keyed the invoice, so we owe the vendor, which means accounts payable has increased, and increasing a normal credit balance of a liability, that is why it receives the credit. So this is what is happening behind the scenes when an invoice is actually entered. Now that we've entered the invoice, over here in the vendor panel, you'll see that invoice is now showing up in their balance. We've entered a couple of other vendors so that you can start to see how the left-hand side would actually look. Over here in the right-hand side is now where you can see the detail of that vendor, and you see that that invoice number has actually been keyed. This time we're clicking on a vendor where we are going to, in the new transaction tab, and we are going to add a bill. We've selected Wiley Advertising as our vendor. When this vendor was set up, a general ledger number was pre-selected. So by selecting that, it already populated for us. That's the importance of doing that in the vendor setup, because they are doing advertising in this particular case for the street department, which is part of Public Works. The memo line is a good thing to decide what is going to be used here. If you key something in the memo lines, just remember it will print on various reports, so you want to be very cautious about what you actually put in those memo lines to help you jog your memory or help you to remember what things are actually for. This particular vendor we set up with a term of 15 days, so that is why when it auto-populated its bill date, it was 15 days from the date of the actual invoice. Again, I can't reiterate enough how important vendor setup is in your process. We're going to enter a third invoice, and this vendor was Cape Supply Company. And when we set up this vendor, we set up two departments that actually use this vendor. The police department and the street department both use this. And so you can see that supplies and materials are where they're coded in both departments, but then supplies is part of a line item in the police budget, and police is part of public safety. So that's our general ledger setup that we did in our first QuickBooks session. And we will key here the portion that is the street department and the portion that is the police department, and the total of the invoice will be here. Now we're back to these three invoices that we've entered. If you will click on one of the column headings, it will actually sort by that. So we've clicked on the balance column. Now you'll see that it's sorted the vendors that we owe the most at the top and the vendors that we owe the least at the bottom. If we ever want to get back to the alphabetical order, we just click on name, and it'll take us back to that alphabetical order. Remember, we're looking at the process flow inside of AP. We've entered these invoices, and we've actually entered three. And after we did our vendor setup, we entered those invoices. Now we are starting to look at our paying feature. Some cities pay weekly and pay all vendors due, and some cities pay vendors when their invoices are due. I personally prefer to use the due date method to only pay vendors when they're due. That maximizes your cash flow, but timely payments of vendors is important, and you also have to allow enough mail time so that you can make sure that the check actually gets receipted to them before the due date actually occurs. You can see that there is a tab over here that says write checks, and oftentimes the question is, well, why do I not just go over here and write checks as opposed to do the pay bills? If you do the write checks function, you'll be able to key the check that you're actually writing, but what you lose and what you give up is the vendor detail, meaning the invoice numbers and the vendor information about each one of those invoices, and you lose really a lot of functionality of AP. So that is why this is actually a better way to actually do your AP, to enter the bills and do your payment processing. When we click Pay Bills right here, what's going to happen is we're going to pull up a window. And here is where all of the invoices that we currently have, because we have clicked up here, Show All Bills. So this is showing us all 3 invoices that we've entered for these 3 vendors. I've selected by due date. You could select by vendor, depending on how you actually want these to sort. You can individually select your items, or actually you can select all of them, depending on which direction you want to take. But there's a couple of key things to check on this screen. One is make sure it's coming out of the right checking account, and make sure you've got enough cash to cover what's about to come out of this checking account. Now we're using, for example purposes, this cash account has $1, but if you were to select all 3 of these vendors, $35.25 would be coming out of your checking account. So you want to make sure that that is the right checking account and that you have sufficient funds to do it. Also, you want to check this date, because this is actually the date that will print on the check. So, and you always date the checks for the date that they're being printed and going out in the mail. And oftentimes you do not hold checks, you try to get those out very quickly. I'm just going to print Wiley Advertising right now. So what I've done is I'm going to place a check mark in Wiley Advertising just to pick it, just so we can see what one vendor would actually look like. What happens when you click that is now a new dialog box comes up, and it says, it's asking you again, are you sure this is what you want to do? You've selected a payment date of 1/20. You've selected the bank of all banks to actually take this money out of it. Are you really sure this is what you want to do? And then you click Print Checks down at the bottom. When you do, it's going to prompt you for a check number. Now, when you're using this a lot, it's going to prompt you, it's going to automatically put that account number in or that check number in. But right now, you're having to put it in because we haven't used this product. Again, always check that bank account to make sure this check is going to come out of the right checking account, and you click OK. Here is where you will decide what type of check you're going to print it on and what printer. I have a separate check drawer for my checks, and so I select that check drawer. And your printing structure will be a little bit different depending on kind of what you do. Now there's 3 types of different checks to choose from. There's voucher, standard, and wallet. I like the voucher checks. The reason I like the voucher checks, you can order those from Intuit or some other places that supply products for Quickbooks. But I like the voucher check because it's perforated into 3 parts. And what happens is I just tear off the bottom part and I actually attach that to the invoices I'm paying, and then the vendor gets the top portion of the check and the remittance stub to show. But that's just what I prefer and what I like. Now, QuickBooks does allow you to put a digital signature if that is something you're interested in doing. I do not recommend that because in very small cities, because normally you're doing a lot of different functions, and the signature may be the only thing that is an internal control element that somebody else is looking at. If you want to insert your logo, it does give you the option to do that too, as well as you can also have your logo printed on your checks when you actually order those checks. Just a few things to think about. When you click that you're going to print the checks, it will pop up. And I can't stress enough that do not get what I call click happy here. If you are clicking through things and you do this one, and if you are printing a lot of checks and something doesn't print correctly, if you click OK here, you have to manually fix all of those. So this is important to make sure your checks have printed exactly the way that you wanted them, because once you bypass this step, having to correct and fix things is much harder. If you happen to print things incorrectly and you don't click the OK button, then you're able to reprint in this particular area. So that is why this becomes an extremely important window. After paying this vendor, now you notice Wiley Advertising's balance is at 0. And over on the right-hand side, not only do you see the invoice, but you also see the check. Don't get confused and caught up by these both being negative amounts. Just always remember it's the bill, you're actually the invoice that you're receiving from the vendor, and the bill payment is actually where you are paying the vendor. Again, behind the scenes, what is happening? You'll notice here the expenditure's not being impacted because it was impacted when you got the goods and services and when it was actually, the invoice was actually entered. Right here, we're paying the invoice. So accounts payable is going to decrease and cash is going to decrease. And this is happening behind the scenes. Cash has a normal debit balance. So if we're going to decrease it, we're going to credit, which means we're going the opposite way. Accounts payable is a liability account. It has a normal credit balance, and if we're going to decrease it, we're going to go the opposite way, so that's why it's a debit. And again, this is just done behind the scenes, but I always think it's important to make sure we understand what is being done behind the scenes. Now let's look a little bit at the AP reports. To run AP reports tell you how much you owe vendors. The AP Aging Summary report, and you get to it from Reports, Vendors and Payables, and then you go to the AP Aging Summary. It will actually tell you kind of how do you owe your vendors. Are they current and are they delinquent? If you look at the AP Detail, which is what I've pulled up here, this will tell you kind of what you've entered related to these vendors. Whether it's an invoice or whether it's a payment. And you'll notice over here under the type is kind of how you tell the difference. Bill being invoice and bill payment check being a check actually to the vendor. But this is how you can always get the detail. This balance right here should always agree to your aging summary. They should always be the same, and you'll notice that both of these numbers in your transaction detail the balance and the balance in your AP. What you always want to look for in your vendors is anybody who's delinquent, anybody you haven't paid over here in the over 30 days. If they're all sitting in current and you've entered your data correctly, then that means you're keeping up with your payable cycle. The missing checks report and the check detail are good reports to run also. Now, you might think that you get all of these through accounts payable, but remember you also have payroll checks that could be run through Quickbooks. So when you're trying to look at check registers and things of that sort, you have to go to reports and you have to go to banking, not the vendors and payables. And so you go to banking and then you go to check detail, and that is how you're going to get your check register. So when the auditor asks you to print them a check register, this is how you go through and get the check registers. And of course, you know, in QuickBooks you can change the dates to anything you want to. And this is just a good opportunity to remind you that all of these diamonds, if you don't like the width of these column headings, you can actually click on that diamond and drag, and it will change the column heading width to help you to be able to see some of your columns. And if you don't want a column as wide, of course, you can make it much narrower by doing that. Another report to help you is the missing checks report. This is a good thing to check on to see if all of your checks are accounted for. I know oftentimes it's really hard to secure check stock, but it's extremely important that we do that, because when checks are missing, somebody could be using those to actually forge or to do something fraudulent. So by doing the missing checks reports through reports, and again it's through banking and missing checks, by doing that report you can have some security over knowing if there's any checks, one, that may not have been keyed into the system, or two, if they're actually missing, you might need to actually stop payment on that so that your cash account is not jeopardized. Another function that we wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about is how to enter a repetitive invoice. Now, this might be a vendor where you have a contract with somebody to provide something on a monthly basis, and they may not invoice you as frequently, but you know that, for example, you need to pay the county a certain amount each month at a certain time. Or you may have a contract for software support, that you have a contract with them for the year, and then you've set up something for payment terms that you're going to pay them monthly or you're going to pay them quarterly. So what you do is you enter the AP invoice just like we did in the prior steps. You select the vendor and you go ahead and set that up. When we get to this particular point, after we have everything entered we want to, notice we don't enter an invoice number, but we enter the date and the due date and the month that this is a monthly fee. We've done an example where we pay an IT firm on a monthly basis. We've coded it to technical professional services. And then after you are finishing enter everything, there's a little memorize button up here, a little icon that has like a Shazam or a call out, and you just click the memorized. When you do that, this is what will pop up, the Memorize Transaction dialog box. So this is where you will determine how you want it to handle these transactions. And this is where you set up that if you want it to be done monthly or quarterly, and what's the next date you want it to occur. Do you want the entry just to happen automatically, or do you want it to send you a reminder for you to take action on it? Which one do you want it to do? So this is what you have to complete when you set these up. I set this one up, for example, for March 1st because we're a little late in paying the February, so that basically on March 1st it will do it, and I've set it up to do this one automatically and to do it on a monthly basis, and I've set it up to do it 10 more months, so that basically it will end on 12/31/2014. So that's why the number remaining becomes important, is because it tells you how to end. In our session today, what we tried to accomplish was we discussed standardization in naming. We also discussed standardization and best practices in how to enter invoices in the AP process through QuickBooks. We learned that the vendor setup process is a really good use to be able to capture information in order to use it later on. We demonstrated how to code invoices and key those invoices using the uniform chart of accounts that we set up in our first session, and we processed payments for vendor, and then we actually reviewed all of those check registers to look for the missing check register or the check register itself, looking for some of those issues that you might need to examine. So we tried to take the accounts payable process from the beginning to the end, and we appreciate your patience with the technical issue that we had earlier. But Pam would like to receive your feedback and to get additional items that you would like to see in future tutorials and training sessions and learning endeavors. So if you will let her know, or if you have questions regarding QuickBooks, if you will contact us and let us know what those questions are. And I'll be more than happy if you want to type in any questions. We'll be happy to answer any of those that we receive.
Sabrina, we haven't received any other questions.
Okay. Well, since we've not received any questions, if you have any additional questions, you see our contact information here. So please feel free to contact us. And thank you so much for attending, and we hope you'll attend our next session.